Welcome back to What's the Juice, where today's episode is with an incredible doctor and advocate for the future of humanity's health, who is changing the way that we think about metabolic health and chronic disease. Dr. Casey Means received her MD from Stanford and went on to be the president of her class, where she then became a talented surgeon and eventually left Western medicine in order to devote her life to tackling the root causes of why Americans are so sick. We're going to get into not only the physical, nutritional, and emotional stress-driven causes of the metabolic health epidemic that we're facing, but we're also going to get into the juiciest, heart-centered, integrative, tangible solutions that just lit me up when we started getting into the nitty-gritty. This isn't going to be something where she tells you to eat these 5 foods for your metabolism. This is where we're going to get into, as always, the root of human health, our connection to one another, our connection to our bodies, and just healing the world as a whole through restoring relationship with one another. She's not only a genius, she's extremely in touch with her soul and spirituality. And when I meet an MD who does both, I'm like, we got to get you on the show. So on today's episode, we're going to cover the financial incentives that are actually driving chronic illness in our healthcare system. She's going to talk about this light bulb moment when she realized that she didn't actually know why her patients were sick. She just knew that she was trained to cut into them through surgery or prescribe. She's going to share why depression, anxiety, infertility, insomnia, Alzheimer's, diabetes, cancer even, all have this one root thing in common, where the dysfunction is stemming on a cellular level from our mitochondria, our energy, and how to take steps to fix and restore our energy so that we can actually repair our cells starting today. Of course, as part of our master philosophy, she's going to share why blood sugar regulation is so key for restoring that mitochondrial and metabolic health, with actionable steps on what you can do to start balancing your blood sugar. We're going to talk about the role of fiber and polyphenols in gut health and blood sugar balance, as well as extremely easy and specific diet changes that you can make today, things you can have on your counter to just throw into your meals to make them more metabolically friendly. She's going to share how to identify your personal root cause and why no 2 people have the same root cause. One person might need to exercise more. Another person, their stress might be coming from exercising when they're already in a completely depleted state. So she's going to teach you how to kind of trust your body and analyze different biomarkers and the language of symptoms to understand where you are on that spectrum. And as always, we find a way to talk about codependency and boundaries, and why setting boundaries in your relationships and with yourself is key in any healing plan, and why boundaries are even related to leaky gut, as above, so below, micro, macro. She also said something so interesting, which is that part of the way that our narrative and philosophy in our Western culture keeps us sort of dependent on outside authority and the healthcare system alone, instead of understanding our own bodies, is through the fear of mortality, and how, strangely enough, accepting the reality of your death and the death of those around you puts more power and autonomy and personal responsibility back into your hands as a patient, a consumer, and a self-advocate. She's really not afraid to go there. And this episode just evolved into so much more than I thought it would. And I'm in awe of this human being. So I hope that you guys love her as much as I do. I hope you deeply enjoyed this episode, and I'm loving this season, guys. Thanks for being along for the ride and for supporting this work and for sharing with friends and leaving us a review and getting the message out there. I so deeply appreciate you. Welcome to the show.
How are you going to grow if you don't know where you're growing from?
Whoa.
This is the scientific proof of grace.
That's wild.
What is healthy to you?
I've just moved toward liberation. Let's get juicy. So I just actually want to jump right in, because we know your credentials and this beautiful book that you've written and all of the incredible work that you've done in the medical field as a doctor and a surgeon. But you recently posted a video on your Instagram when you launched your book. And in that video, you said very boldly, "I didn't actually know why my patients were sick. I was only trained on how to cut into them or prescribe them a drug. These patients were not getting better, and every health institution is financially incentivized for us to be sick, so something isn't right."
So I think this is fundamentally like the first order issue that we're facing as Americans today. We're living in a world right now where children as they grow up, they're not going to outlive their parents. Like life expectancy is going down. And in a country that's spending vastly more on healthcare than any other country in the entire world, our health outcomes are getting worse every year. The more nutrition research we do, the worse our health is getting. The more we spend, the worse our health is getting. So you have to ask yourself, is it possible that we're actually approaching the problem the wrong way? Like this is the definition of unsustainability. Spend more, do more, cut more, drug more, and we're getting sicker. So fundamentally, I think what we're seeing is that there's this really wild devil's bargain between two of the largest industries in the richest country in the world, the food industry and the healthcare industry. And they represent like well over $10 trillion of business. And for their businesses to grow, for their shareholders to get the returns that they need, and they are just businesses, right? Healthcare is a business, food is a business. And for them to grow, which is the only dictum that they have, they need people to be eating as much of that food as possible. And they need more people to be going through that healthcare system as possible. And I think this doesn't change anything about the fact that every doctor I've really ever met is like a good, noble person who went into medicine to help people and to truly try and save lives. But at the end of the day, I think these beautiful, great minds are going into a system that they don't really fully understand, because that system, their intentions, the doctor's intentions are to help people. But the system, and the system is not a person, it's a system. Its incentives are to make money. And in our system, the way that healthcare makes money is by having more patients for a longer period of time, having things done to them. That's the reality. So when I was in the surgery world as a head and neck surgeon, this became so acute for me because, you know, when you're cutting into someone's body unconscious on a table, like it's incredibly dramatic. And especially as like a very sensitive young woman, very empathetic woman, like when you're doing that, like you're kind of there like with that scalpel thinking like, is there like anything else that could possibly we could do to like not get to this point? And the answer is yes, there's a ton we could be doing. So many of the surgeries that we're doing in our country today are for issues that are fundamentally rooted in chronic inflammation and metabolic dysfunction and like excess oxidative stress, these physiologic phenomenons that are happening in bodies, in most American bodies, that are leading to most of our diseases. And there's no surgery that can fix that. There's no surgery that fixes chronic inflammation. Inflammation is the body responding to a perceived threat. And in most of us, that threat is inside the cell. The threat is fundamentally that the cell is metabolically dysfunctional. It's having trouble making energy to power itself. So it's in a complete sort of like threat scenario that recruits the immune system, creates chronic inflammation, and creates symptoms. And so we think that going in there and cutting out that part is going to fix that constant, sense of being petrified that our cells have. No, like that it's not. And so that really, came to a head for me, and I had to walk away from the field because I realized, doing the surgeries in a sense is easy. You do the surgery, you feel like a hero, you get paid. But is it actually easing that sense of threat inside the body that fundamentally is at the core of our cells, in our mitochondrial dysfunction, our metabolic dysfunction? Absolutely not. So I sort of completely changed gears and devoted my life to helping with the metabolic disease epidemic that is creating such sense of terror in many of our bodies.
Those who go into the medical field and become doctors, nurses, anything, PTs, OTs, love you all. Like they're good freaking humans. Yeah. And a surgeon who's cutting into someone on a table for a surgery that they need at that point because things have gotten so bad is saving a life on that day, in that moment. And so, of course, that's going to draw the best of our society essentially to that field. And then I love that you just recognized that although you're saving them that day, what if you can save them throughout their entire life? What if people were empowered with the knowledge to give them a full life, to extend their health span, not just their lifespan? And to your point, because medicine is an industry, you don't get, through insurance stipends for both doctor and patient, you don't get 6 hours to sit with someone who has high cholesterol and go through their sleep their spiritual health, their relationships, if they have a sense of purpose in life, if fear and childhood trauma is taking over their mind, if they're getting a nutrient-dense diet, giving them recipes or tools as to how they can start eating more nutrients. You just don't have that. And so you have a tool at your hand, which is prescribing. You can give them a statin. And unknowingly or unconsciously, perhaps for many doctors, is driving this epidemic that we're seeing of chronic illness by way of the way that the system is structured, just for profit.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're really in like a guidelines-based medicine culture where I was in the otolaryngology head and neck surgery world, and we have guidelines for every disease: sinusitis, otitis media, which is like ear infections, cellulitis, chronic cough, whatever it is. There's like a 20 to 100 page document that's like, this is what you do, step 1 through 100. And I've looked at most of those documents, and nutrition, sleep, stress management, certainly not like addressing childhood trauma, none of that, not even basic nutrition is mentioned anywhere. So if you start to do that, you're practicing out of scope in a way. It's almost a risk. Not only is it a risk from that standpoint of like liability, it's also just a risk to your income because you're not going to get paid for that extra time that you're doing that. So it's essentially like pro bono work to talk to a patient about that. And when hospitals are basically looking for how much you're billing, and that's a big part of, promotions and whether you're going to be able to keep your job, it becomes like survival mode, I think, for a lot of practitioners. And you kind of have to play the game that's set up. But unfortunately, that game is set up for financial interests and not necessarily patient interests. But, with all that said, there is such a beautiful movement happening where so many doctors are waking up to this. This is like a lot of the people you have on your podcast, like Gabrielle Lyon and others. And it's like there's a huge sea change happening, which is beautiful. But I think with podcasts like this, it's like, let's make it happen faster and like have patients be aware so they can ask more questions.
And it's like this fine line of the comfort of authority and training that doctors have, and the way that we almost want to listen to that authority completely, especially when that authority doesn't have the training in the other areas, or not trained in herbs and nutrition. So they can't advise there. They can't even lead you down the road of, hey, maybe you should go see this herbalist, or maybe you should go talk to this person. And so it's hard because you want to listen to sound medical advice, but then you also want to find people, whether they're coaches, alternative practitioners, et cetera, who are just as qualified and nuanced in other ways and can help you implement those things that will actually make the difference in the mitochondria. Like all of the things that you mentioned will help to optimize your sleep, will help to talk you through what's really contributing to your stress, because often we just need to be witnessed by someone in order to see. We have the answer within us. We know why we're stressed. We know what's going on, and often we know the solution and what we need to do. But until somebody deeply sees and witnesses us, we either don't recognize it or don't have the permission or the confidence to think that we can even heal ourselves. Yeah, it's this culture of authority, and you want to do what your doctor says. And if he says that herbs or meditation or whatever is not going to work for your high cholesterol, you are scared to go alternatively. And there's a lot of alternative practitioners that don't know what they're doing.
Totally. But this gets back to, I think, a lot of what you talk about, which is trusting your body, and like the answers are within. I think about like the distraction industrial complex of our world. It's like everything's fighting for our attention. Our body is so profitable. Our attention is profitable. Putting things into our body is profitable. Taking things out of our body is profitable. It's all profitable. So it's like, I do spend a lot of time in this sort of like protective maternal energy about my body of like, I'm not going to really let anyone else. It's a boundary, right? It's like, no, like I understand how I can be profitable, and I'm going to be very like selective of how I let that in or not. If it's a beautiful product that I want to buy, I'm like, I'm happy to like that, I'll put that product into my body and I'll pay you for that, But I want that to be like such a aware, eyes open, like interaction. But so I think it's not to scare people, and unfortunately this is happening to children too. It's like kids are getting sicker and sicker, and it's like, how much processed food can we put in their bodies? How many medications and vaccines can we put into their bodies? Like they're these units of profit to a lot of industry. And like, that sounds a little pessimistic, but I think we have to understand the incentives to be able to kind of like protect ourselves. And I think there's a chapter in my book that has a little bit of an inflammatory title, but it says, trust yourself, not your doctor. And the reason I say that is for two reasons. One is because your body is always trying to tell you the answers. Like symptoms are your body telling you that the body needs something else. It might need rest. It might need different nutrients. It might need a hug. It might need support. Like our bodies are little like molecule, like manufacturing machines. And so like, if you're really stressed, maybe your body is telling you that with a symptom and you need to take a deep diaphragmatic breath so you can like squirt out some acetylcholine from your vagus nerve and like ease your body and your parasympathetic nervous system. Maybe you need a hug so that you can squirt out some oxytocin and like calm yourself. People have said this before me, but like symptoms are a gift. And I think we need, like, your body has the answers. So that's one. And you need to tune in and hear it and learn how to communicate with your symptoms and your innate knowing and not be told by anyone not to trust that. But I do think in many ways, our system is actually telling us not to trust our own bodies. Trust your doctor. Don't trust yourself, and that's crazy.
When you talk about the part of this cell that's being drained or that makes energy, are you referring to the mitochondria, and why are our mitochondria so sick?
Yeah, I'm talking about the mitochondria. And so sort of the high school biology refresher for listeners, although I know you've had many metabolic experts on the podcast, but this is this part of our cell that literally transforms food energy into cellular energy. And we have like 40 plus trillion cells, and every single one of our cells are doing billions, if not trillions, of chemical reactions per second. And all of those take energy. Like we need a coin to put in the machine to like get it to run. And that is ATP, which is made by the mitochondria when we convert food to energy. And the result of these trillions upon trillions of chemical reactions, it bubbles up into our lives. That's our lived experience. That's our consciousness. That's everything. That's our life. Without that, we would literally melt into a blob and decompose on the ground. Like that's death, essentially, the absence of mitochondrial function. And so what's happening in our world today, we know that about 93% of American adults now have metabolic dysfunction. And we can kind of say, there's a lot of terms that we can kind of use for metabolic dysfunction. Metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, mitochondrial dysfunction. They're all kind of getting at this same thing, prediabetes, blood sugar dysregulation. They're all interlinked. And so sort of like the very short version of that is that if our mitochondria aren't working to convert food to energy properly, the body will basically stop taking glucose into the cell to convert to ATP because the mitochondria is not working. So it's like we can't do anymore. So it puts up a block, and that block is insulin resistance. So then insulin rises in the body to try and force that food energy into the cell. But the cell's like, nope, we can't do anything with it. And then, of course, the blood sugar levels rise. The insulin levels rise in response because it's trying to push that glucose in. And then that causes lots of problems in the body, both glucose elevated in the bloodstream and insulin elevated in the bloodstream, both cause problems all over the body. And what we fundamentally end up with is an overwhelmed, overburdened cell that's mitochondria is essentially saying as loudly as it possibly can, I need help. And the reason our mitochondria are suffering so much in our modern world is because so many aspects of our modern industrial living, oddly enough, synergistically hurts the mitochondria. So on every level, this very recent world we're living in is like attacking this organelle, which is kind of wild. So you think about like chronic low-grade stress, like from seeing all this like intense news on our social media feeds 24 hours a day, seeing like the struggles of 8 billion people around the world on your phone in bed. What's that doing to our cortisol levels? Shooting it up. What does that do? Impairs mitochondrial function. Then we look at our micronutrient depleted food. We're eating 60 to 70% ultra-processed food that's devoid in the key micronutrients that our bodies need to function. Well, a lot of those micronutrients are actually mitochondrial cofactors. They're literally like lock and key cofactors that allow our mitochondria to work. So the ultra-processed food is feeding into it. Then you think about our soil depletion from industrial agriculture and the fact that our soil is literally dead and lifeless because we thought we were being efficient with industrial agriculture and we basically killed the soil through synthetic pesticides and mechanized tilling. So now our soil is depleted. So we have, it's hurting our microbiome and it's hurting the nutrient composition of our food. So even if you're eating whole foods, it's less nutrient dense than it would have if the soil were more thriving. Well, what does that do to our mitochondria? Well, the microbiome is super important for making things called short-chain fatty acids, which are mitochondrial regulators, and again, the nutrients in our food that are, a direct result of the health of the soil are mitochondrial cofactors. Sleep deprivation hurts mitochondrial function. So when we look at sleep, sedentary behavior, chronic low-grade stress, our ultra-processed diets, the fact that we're seeing artificial light at night, the fact that there are almost 100,000 synthetic toxins that have been introduced into our food, water, and air in the past 100 years, they all hit the mitochondria. And so it's breaking, and that's showing up as this metabolic spectrum.
Can you just reiterate for us why poor metabolic health and, quote, bad energy is at the root of everything from Alzheimer's to insomnia to type 2 diabetes, all the way to cancer? Because it's almost, people listening are going to be like, how can one thing be connected to all? And then if you can start to give us some of these tangible, principles of eating or key steps that people should take.
So it's actually quite simple how all these different, seemingly different conditions are connected by the same root cause of bad energy or metabolic dysfunction. The reason is because we have over 200 cell types in our body, from ovarian theca cells to endothelial cells to retinal cone cells to astrocytes. Every single one of those cell types needs energy to do its work. And a cell that can't do its work properly, the trillions of chemical reactions that it needs to do to basically do its function, will have dysfunction. And so an underpowered cell leads to dysfunction of that cell. And in different cell types, underpowering looks different. In a neuron, based on what neuron type it is, it could look like depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, Alzheimer's dementia, chronic pain, or migraine. All of those conditions, we know, are either accelerated by or significantly worsened by insulin resistance, mitochondrial dysfunction, metabolic dysfunction. If it's happening in an ovary cell, an ovarian theca cell, that could look like polycystic ovarian syndrome. It could look like problems with ovulation, which leads to the leading cause of infertility in the United States. If it's happening in an endothelial cell, a dysfunctional, underpowered endothelial cell, which is the lining of the blood vessels, that could generate, of course, we talked about underpowering will recruit immune cells because that's scary to be underpowered. Well, all of a sudden you get a bunch of immune cells in the blood vessel linings. What happens? Cholesterol gets trapped. You get atherosclerotic plaques. You get heart disease. In small vessels, blockage of vessels can look like retinopathy, erectile dysfunction. In the brain, it could look like stroke. So it's really about the fact that the same root cause of underpowering, metabolic dysfunction, mitochondrial dysfunction in different cell types can emerge as a different look. But really what's happening in the cell can be quite similar. And I think that a question that people might have is like, well, why in some people does it look different than other people? And there's not really, I think, a good answer.
Yeah, why does the body choose?
Right, yeah. But I do think if you look at like the average patient who walks into a functional medicine clinic, like my first patient, I remember when I opened up a functional medicine clinic after I left the surgical world, I had them do like all this extensive paperwork because I really want to get to know every aspect of the patient. He had 42 symptoms. And like, he came in and was like, not like, he was kind of just like, I just don't feel great. And I've got a couple of these like issues my doctor's diagnosed me with, but like, he wasn't the type of person who was like falling apart. Like he was still, but he had 42 symptoms. So it's like, it is showing up in a lot of cell types for a lot of people. The arthritis, they can't get an erection as well as they used to. They have some brain fog. They get migraines every once in a while. They've got some acid reflux. They've got, their big toe has a fungal infection. I don't know. It's like these things do stack up. And I think we've actually gotten so almost like brainwashed to think a lot of this stuff is normal. I talk about my childhood in the book where like I'm 14 and I'm like, this like high achieving, like I want to go to Stanford, So I'm like, I'm anxious. I have jawline acne. I have horrible PMS. And I'm like 200 pounds. I was like overweight, but I was like 6 feet tall. So like I'm overweight. I have painful periods. I have acne. I have anxiety, and I always had back pain. And I thought I was like, I'm just like everyone has this stuff. Like I'm like a healthy, I'm like super vibrant girl. But now looking back, I'm like, I was like sick, but we just consider these things as normal. So anyways, all that is to say that it's different cell types showing up the same issue in different ways because a cell type is going to basically have a different symptom profile if it's not working properly.
I initially can bucket the Alzheimer's, the insomnia, the type 2 diabetes. I can bucket all those, but then to me, cancer feels like its own different beast of how could that possibly be related to metabolic dysfunction? But then I remember I had a teacher in herb school, Dr. Jody Noe, shout out, who was like, yeah, cancer is a distraction of the immune system. The immune system is distracted over there with the chronic inflammation, whether that's the metabolic dysfunction, whether that's the gut inflammation like we talked about. So because it's over there trying to put out the fire, all of a sudden this abnormal cell over here starts multiplying. And there's no alarm system because the immune system is distracted. The immune system doesn't clear that cancer cell that's multiplying. All of a sudden, it's multiplied a lot. All of a sudden, there's a tumor. All of a sudden it starts, stealing all these resources, and it just grows out of control.
On top of that, I think another thing to just think about with that cancer story is like, distraction of the immune system, but also like the immune system cells also need energy to function properly. So you might be having chronic inflammation like happening, but those cells might be quite dysfunctional, the immune cells. And so I think we're absolutely seeing metabolic dysfunction in our immune cells. They're all cells, right? They all need glucose to process. And then you think about a cancer cell, and really every chemical reaction needs cellular energy to function properly. So let's think about, there are literally little protein machines that come into once we replicate a cell, that come and repair errors that are made when the DNA is replicated. Like there's DNA mismatch repair enzymes. There's these like all sorts of different proteins that our body have that are like little trucks that come over and like scan and make sure they all need energy to function properly. So it's like at every level, like underpowering, can basically create an environment where like a cell that has the wrong genetic code basically could kind of slip through the cracks. On top of that, tied into the metabolic story, is that so many of these environmental toxins and endocrine disruptors and things that are like chemicals in our environment that are literally damaging our DNA, so many of them are both can cause mutations and can also disrupt our mitochondrial function. So this sort of chemical stew that we're living in is not only detrimental to our metabolic health, but it's also like directly mutagenic. And so, for each chemical, it's got a different profile of how it impacts the cell, like whether it's a phthalate or a paraben or whatever. Yeah, it's a difficult sort of stew that we're living in. So being aware and
how like negative thoughts and trauma are also part of that stew and also are mutagenic to cells, and it's just all connected.
Yeah.
So, okay. You've just painted such a picture, and I'm really getting it. I'm getting good energy. It's like, okay, I didn't even connect the immune cells also need energy from metabolic health. That just puts it all together. And so give us these first few steps. Obviously, your book is full of these tangible steps, but give us someone who's listening is like, I'm ready to take action.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Well, let's start with food.
Okay.
There's really like 5 elements of metabolically healthy meals that I love, which are trying to incorporate in your meals fiber, omega-3s, antioxidant source, probiotic source, and healthy protein. And I'm with Gabrielle Lyon, like aiming for about 30 grams of protein or more per meal is like a great place to start. So having at arm's reach sources of each of those things, I think is just such an easy way to like essentially throw meals together. So it's like for omega-3s, have a few cans of sardines and wild-caught salmon, some chia seeds, basil seeds, flax seeds in the pantry. Boom. Make a salad, throw a little bit of that on. The way to make it easier, I think, is to actually just keep a lot of fiber sources like on your counter, like at the ready, so that you can just dump essentially. It's like, this is like a topper for a lot of meals. So some of my favorite sources, so like basil seeds are like fancy chia seeds that have more omega-3s, more vitamins, minerals, and more fiber. So 2 tablespoons of basil seeds, which you can also make just like chia pudding. You can make basil seed pudding with it, exact same thing. But 2 tablespoons has 10 grams of fiber. So like, whoa, pretty much anything I'm eating, I'll put a tablespoon of basil seeds on it.
Does it need to become mucilaginous or like soak in liquid for it to be beneficial? Because it'll do that in the gut anyway.
It'll do it in the gut.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll do that. I keep like high fiber nuts and seeds around. So like sesame seeds, flax seeds, ground flax seeds, walnuts, pecans, they all have fiber, like pretty good amount of fiber. So that's let's say I have 3 tablespoons of chia and basil seeds, that's 15 grams. Maybe a tablespoon of flax in a smoothie, that's like 5 grams. I will cook like a lot of beans and legumes at the beginning of the week in the slow cooker, or just have organic beans around. 99 cents a can, organic beans at Whole Foods, BPA-free cans. But 1 can of black beans has 35 grams of fiber. So what I'll do, because I've realized this, my pain point with beans is the opening the can and rinsing it. I don't know. It's annoying. It's like you got to get the colander out, you got to dry them, like whatever. So I'm like, okay, I'll do it once. So I'll open like, if I'm not cooking the beans, I'll open like 5 cans on a Monday. Pinto, kidney, black bean, garbanzo bean. Get it over with, rinse them all at the same time, pat them dry, put them in Tupperware. And then every time I'm making something, 1/4 cup, dump it on top. Eggs, throw some beans on it. Salad, throw some beans on it. So that's another like 10, 15 grams there. And then between fruits and vegetables, Brussels sprouts are high fiber, broccoli and cauliflower. And of course they have a million other benefits too. And then the highest fiber fruit of all of them, raspberries, 8 grams of fiber per cup. And so if I'm going to choose between like an orange or an apple, and if I need to hit like my fiber goal, I'll go with raspberries, and I keep them in the freezer. Probiotic sources. I love to always have 2 or 3 flavors of sauerkraut in my fridge. I love to have an unsweetened yogurt in the fridge. I love kvass, which is essentially like very low sugar kombucha. Have a few of those in the fridge. So when you're grabbing a drink, grab your kvass. If you need a sweet treat, have your probiotic rich yogurt with some chia seeds and some raspberries. There you've got probiotics, protein, fiber, micronutrients. Boom, good energy meal. Put some flax seeds on, you've also got omega-3s. So really knowing your antioxidant and micronutrient sources, which is like, to just put it very simply, it's like colorful fruits and vegetables, spices, teas. Those are going to have some of the top sources. And then having some great protein sources at the ready. I know you're into protein. You're working with Dr. Lyon, who's just like, love her so much. But like, you got to have it in your house. And that does take a shopping shift. It's like, I need to have a freezer that has a lot of bison, venison, elk. I keep it all in the freezer so that if I've got nothing handy, I just defrost one and I'm ready to go. Right there, that's, let's see, it's almost 4 servings, 26 grams of protein. That's almost 100 grams of protein in that little thing. I've always got eggs in the fridge. I've always got fish in the pantry. I've got my beans and legumes, which are good protein. So it's like keeping these components accessible so it doesn't feel overwhelming, knowing what the top sources of each of those 5 things are, and then whatever you're making, grabbing a little bit of each. You know, if you're going to make a creamy sauce, use it with unsweetened yogurt to get your probiotics. If you're eating eggs, put sauerkraut on top. So that's kind of, you know, a framework for thinking about meals, is just really trying to get those five components in. And they all directly help mitochondrial health: omega-3s, fiber, micronutrients, healthy protein, and probiotic source. So that's just like one thing. And then again, it's like, it's not as fun to talk about the things to take out, but I'm like, I genuinely believe like everyone's life will be happier and healthier if we just read labels and really try and move away from foods that have refined, ultra-processed grains and industrially refined seed oils. So, and I know you've had an episode about seed oils. This does not mean seed oils, like, it's the nuance.
I can do a little bit of omega-6 or a little bit of seed oil once in a while because the rest of my diet is omega-3s and fats that I'm cooking at home. That's where the nuance is of like, yes, consume less seed oils, but they're also not the devil. It's the ratio.
It's definitely the ratio. I think it's one thing that I think is important for people to realize is like, because they're like, why are seed oils bad? And it's like, it all comes down to biochemistry. Omega-3 fats and omega-6 fats are processed by the same set of enzymes, these desaturase enzymes that basically convert an omega-6 acid into like arachidonic acid, which is a downstream pro-inflammatory fat, or omega-3s, plant-based omega-3s, alpha-linoleic acid, down to EPA and DHA, which are the anti-inflammatory omega-3s. They use the same enzymes. So we want those EPA and DHAs. And so if you're eating a chia seed, which is filled with alpha-linoleic acid, you want to get it to EPA and DHA because those are going to incorporate into your cell membrane, and your immune cells are going to use those to snip off and literally make anti-inflammatory molecules. But if you're loading your body with the omega-6 fats, you're blocking the enzymes that convert. Also, those enzymes have several nutrient cofactors like B vitamins, vitamin C, zinc.
You're using your nutrients.
So people say like plant-based omega-3s are inferior to animal-based omega-3s. And in a sense, that's true. What needs to be in the cell membrane is EPA and DHA. But then we like lose the forest for the trees and think like, well, how do you actually make EPA and DHA? You convert it through a several step pathway that is blocked by omega-6s and it's blocked by a nutrient depleted diet. So less omega-6s, more high nutrient foods.
Now that I know they compete for the enzyme, maybe I'm a little bit less a fan of nuance. Maybe I'm a little bit more anti-seed oil. I just originally was like, I just hate the dogma and the absolute statements, you know?
Yeah.
So that's why originally I became like our seed oil is actually the devil crusader, but I renounced my title.
No. I mean, it's all
It's
context.
just good to know. It's good
all
to
just
know.
context.
I didn't know that piece of it. That's really
that is one that really tipped me over the edge for motivation. Because I'm like, when you're thinking about what can I do to free up space to create the things that are going to have me have a happier life, I'm always thinking inside the cell and I'm like, just this little protein that wants to do work to help me. And if I give it stuff that blocks it, like I'm not helping myself, you know?
Yes. Okay, so that's the food piece. What else do we need to be doing that's either low touch or high touch but highly impactful? Because I'll go out, I'm trying to watch the sunrise in the mornings. I'm seeing how that changes how I feel. Is that impactful enough that I should be working really hard to do it? What are these things that are magical that are available to us?
From the light piece, I do think it's really impactful to get outside and look at the sky, not directly at the sunlight, but get photons hitting your eyeballs within the first hour of the day.
Within the first hour of sunrise.
I think it's, not everyone's going to be up at sunrise. Yes, I think the ideal situation would be to do it at sunrise because of the angle of the light. And it's got all this, Huberman talks about this. It's awesome. But I think for the average person,
okay,
I think a lot of people, especially if you work at home, I've surveyed some friends about this. Some people aren't going outside for 4 or 5 hours. They just get up, they have breakfast, they drink their coffee, they sit at the computer, and then it's noon. And it's oh, okay, I'll go out and get the mail or whatever. But it's holy moly,
go out right away.
Yes. And the reason for that is it is a light switch for your metabolic pathways. Inside the body, it is dark. It is nighttime inside the body. The way that our body knows that it is daytime and it needs to do all this metabolic stuff for us are photons hitting our retinas. So it's a physical interaction with photons. So it's you can't do it inside. You can't just do it at the window. It doesn't matter if it's cloudy. The photons are still there. So that's a really big one. I think the side piece of doing that is that getting outside is so good for our nervous systems. It's also starting your day with nature, with awe. If you can do that at a green space, that's great. But and I've heard you talk about this on other podcasts about with Liz Moody, I think perspectives and seeing distances. But the second you get outside of your little box that we're in, these little boxes that we've chosen to put our bodies in 22 hours a day, it immediately is a perspective shift that there's something bigger than you. And there's a star and a planet that we can look at, and there's birds that are chirping, and all of it entrenches a sense of abundance, which also calms us, I think. So it's awe, because there's a lot in my book I talk about awe as really an antidote to fear. And I think aside from the sunlight, it's just starting the day with a sense of bigger picture, which you just are not going to get inside your house.
Awe is an antidote to fear. I need that tattooed on my forehead. I really love that.
And I would say one huge one, I'm just going to try and think of some surprising things that I learned when I was writing the book. A huge one is how detrimental light exposure is in the bedroom while you are sleeping. So we really want our rooms to be dark. Even a tiny, tiny amount of light from a clock or a window can totally change our melatonin expression and delay melatonin expression and change our sleep quality. So digging through that research, a very simple hack for getting the most out of the time you're spending in bed is to make your room pitch dark. Obviously, turn your phone off. Turn your phone upside down so that it's not having the light go off when text comes in. Obviously, turn vibrate off. Get rid of the LED alarm clock and get blackout shades. And put duct tape over the, green dot on the fire, CO2 monitor. It all matters. You really don't want to be able to like see your hand in front of your face when you're in your bedroom, and it will absolutely change the quality of your sleep. The other like one that I feel like just blew my mind in terms of the research from the book is really kind of the term we have for it, of like we've come up with fancy terms for everything, right? In science is NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is basically the term for moving your body more throughout the day. So it's like essentially every time you're moving your body that's not exercise. But I think one thing that's really fascinating is that like as gym memberships have gone up in the United States, obesity rates have increased basically in a parallel way. So the more gym memberships we have, the more obesity go up. The more household per capita spend on gyms, the more obesity goes up. And I think this is really fascinating because it almost makes you wonder, is the concept of exercise the problem? Mm-hmm. So in 1820, 75% of Americans were basically farming on their property. Like they were growing food on their property or in the physically demanding field of agriculture, essentially. So we were moving all day long. By the 1870s, that had dropped to like 20%. Now it's less than 2%. So our jobs obviously have become less physically demanding. We're knowledge workers now. And so our biology, which is primed to need regular low-grade movement all day as an energetic signal for certain metabolic pathways to be active, has been totally shut down. And then we've replaced it with this little 1 to 2 hour block once a day that activates those pathways, certainly, but only in a little focused period of time. So not only is it a stressor because it's one more thing for us to do, but it's only activating pathways for a short period of time, usually in a pretty intense way. So looking at the data on NEAT, people who do more NEAT have less obesity.
And
less
NEAT
diabetes.
is just moving around more often throughout the day.
Basically,
it's cleaning your house.
It's anything you're doing that moves your body that's not actually exercise. So it's walking from the car to the grocery store, it's fidgeting your leg at your desk, it's gardening, it's washing the dishes, it's dancing, it's playing with your kids, it's playing a sport, it's throwing a ball. It's non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And it's thermogenesis because it literally generates heat. And our mitochondria are little furnaces that generate heat. So I think it's just basically we're kind of due for like a reframe of the concept of movement versus exercise, because the fact of the matter is a body that's moving in a low-grade way like NEAT is constitutively activating the channels that usually live inside the cell, the glucose channels, the GLUT4 channels, to move to the cell membrane and let glucose into the cell. Just moving a little bit will cause those channels to move to the cell membrane. If you're sitting all day, they're not at the membrane. If you're just lightly moving your muscles, they're at the membrane. So this is why, people will say, exercising doesn't outdo the effects of sitting, but we have to think about why at the cellular level. It's because you're literally not sending the signal to take this vesicle of GLUT4 channels to the membrane. So this is why those Apple Watch annoying little pings that say, stand up every 30 minutes, they make the biggest difference because you're physically pushing your glucose channels to the membrane. So that's just hopefully motivating for people of like, this isn't supposed to be annoying. Like, stand up and do 5 air squats every half hour. It's actually changing what's happening at your cell membrane in a way that is going to help for your metabolic health. So yeah, I think NEAT is very important, and finding ways to take activities that you currently do sitting and figure out how to make them standing or moving. So what I would do and what I have done is look at the things I do every day, work, respond to emails, whatever it is, and think, is there a way I could do this with more activity? So washing dishes, you're already moving. Chopping, usually we're standing up while we're chopping. But like reading your mail, can you do it at a standing desk? It's probably gonna be better for you. When you're catching up with your partner at the end of the day, can you guys throw a ball in the backyard instead of sitting? Like throw a football? Can you take one walk around the block to catch up? And usually all it takes is saying to someone, hey, before we sit down, you wanna just take a quick walk? We'll catch up. And usually the other person is like, yes. That's exactly what I want to do. But you know how it is. The second you get on that couch, you're going to be there for an hour chatting. So be that person.
Walking dates.
Yeah, exactly.
On a spiritual level, I just want to say that I feel in my soul what's happening with the shift towards freedom and autonomy and healing. I know we're in like probably maybe the darkest point right now, but I feel that we're at the turning point, the darkest turning point. So I feel this shift forward is leading us away from this codependent way in which we've functioned for so long with everything in our lives, all the way from other countries being codependent on the US dollar to the way that we are codependent with our doctors being our authority figure and saying, well, if they don't tell me to do it, then I can't because they are the boss of me in ways where my autonomy does not exist. I feel that we're moving to this sense of sovereignty and interdependence through the empowerment of us being able to be trusted enough by very intelligent figures like yourself to say, hey, yeah, actually, I'm going to give you this information because I trust you enough to know and learn how to read them and that you're going to understand it because you're freaking smart too. And that is truly the break from the disease of codependency that we've been suffering from for so long. And I think we've been suffering from it in our interpersonal relationships too. That's where things started to click for me. And it has led me to realize that, oh, that's actually just a reflection of the codependent way in which I'm liaising with the rest of the world.
Like if you think about all the things we all like learn in like basic therapy, right? With like, which when you say, it's like, it's thinking about, well, I shouldn't speak for everyone, but I think there's a lot of themes that emerge about what you're talking about. Codependency, like what are the behaviors that I'm doing? Essentially, like in some way I'm not recognizing, serving to soothe some wound in me that I haven't addressed yet. Like how am I leaning on these other things in a negative way in what is leading to negative repercussions in my life because I think it's safety, because I think it's actually protecting that wounded child that I haven't even identified yet. And if you think about that and apply it to our relationship with the healthcare system, it's like the same. So as we wake up to those things and those realities and the need for boundary setting and saying no and self-love and listening to ourselves and how that helps us disentangle from our codependency, it's like you could just apply that all, I think, you know, to the healthcare system. And that does not mean you stop interacting with other people or stop leaning on people but it's about a healthy relationship where you are autonomous and you, on that spiritual level, your sovereignty, but also understand that you exist in community and interdependency, but not codependency. And so, you know, I love that, like what you're just saying about how like there's parallels between like sort of the self-work journey and I think our relationship with the healthcare system. And I think there's just two other pieces that were coming up for me while you were talking, like just sort of more about the health journey and the spiritual journey. One is that, and I saw this really when I was in the surgical world, it was kind of indoctrinated in me, and I had to disentangle from it when I left that world, which is that the conventional healthcare system weaponizes the fear of death in order to control people and get them to basically do anything. So if you can convince a person to be just truly afraid of mortality, then all of a sudden, like anything you suggest that could possibly, you know, mitigate that fear or maybe like extend their time to death, they'll do it. So you could really, it's used as this tool to, I think, control people. And I think in so many other traditions, non-Western traditions, there's such a different and more rich and comprehensive framework for mortality. Like mortality is scary. Like we don't totally know what's on the other side, but so many other traditions like we don't have in the West, they engage with that with curiosity. They think and meditate on the cycles of life and the transformation of energy and matter that we're a part of. And, you know, the beautiful, everyone's framework is different, but like this beautiful duality that we may be experiencing right now of essentially having a physical body that is having this dualistic experience in life of being a spirit from the eternal source energy in a physical body. And that's what, you know, maybe we're doing here. Everyone has a different spiritual belief, but that's one that pervades many traditions. And so by engaging with that and going down that journey of examining, like, what does this mean, you know, and thinking about our bodies in this sort of like eternal cycle of matter, I think it actually lifts some of that like terror about mortality that is sometimes used against us by systems. And so all that is to say, I think that journey of exploration about the concept of death and about the fact that we are going to die and what is our true nature is really important for actually gaining that power to make decisions in healthcare from a place of abundance and fearlessness rather than a place of like desperation and scarcity. Save me from death. No one's saving you from death. Yep. No, not your doctor. And, so maybe it's worth asking that question, like, is death even real? Like our Western conception of like, we're alive and then we die. Like, and so I think that's a journey that everyone needs to go on, because in that exploration, even having that curiosity, it is a form of power against a system that wants you to be petrified so that you will basically buy any solution that could ease that anxiety. And then the second piece with body awareness and kind of spirituality that I find fascinating as it pertains to like technology is like, you think about like Buddhism and many traditions, like attachment is the root of suffering. And like being attached to things is what causes us pain. And so cravings are a form of suffering, like, wanting something that you can't control. And when you think about, we're learning more recently through the research that many cravings are actually just like a direct result of our glucose in our blood spiking and crashing. Like literally a paper in Nature from like a year and a half ago that's like, you can predict people's desire for sugar based on how much they crash after a blood sugar spike. And of course, they're not like talking about Buddhism or suffering or ego in this paper. But like, if you think about it, like I have been in a place where I have had intense cravings in life before I like kind of found, more the wellness path, where like I would never leave the house without like a fun size candy. Like I didn't want to be without a source of sugar because like, would I be okay? And you end up adopting that identity as like, well, I'm not someone with a lot of self-control and like, I need my sugar and like, I'm undisciplined and like blame, shame. And like, this is your identity. And like, that is in a sense, a form of suffering because it's craving, attachment, suffering. But then when you like wearing a continuous glucose monitor and you're like, oh, I ate this stuff. I ate a naked carb. It was super high carb. I didn't walk after, I didn't pair it with protein, fat, and fiber. I had a huge spike, I had a huge crash, and then I wanted more sugar. It's like, this is not about me. This is just like biology. And I can totally stabilize that. Take the apple cider vinegar before the meal, pair it with protein, fat, and fiber, walk after the meal, ease your glucose spike. It means you won't have as much of a crash. Your cravings are relieved. And you're like, oh, in a sense, I've just moved towards liberation. I just moved actually towards lack of attachment to a thing that I thought I needed. So that's just one example of like how I do think some of this like self-awareness of what our body is saying, which a lot can be done through just general body awareness, but some can be helped through wearables, can be super liberating on our path towards freedom.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I love that the focus of your current work and book and company is glucose management, because it is such a pillar. It's a pillar that I've gotten into, obviously, very heavily the last few years as I had insulin resistance and reversed it. Thank you, Dr. Gabrielle Line, and everyone who helped me along the way. I also think that's why my glucose bitters formula is one of our best sellers, because it's so top of mind for people and it's so effective when it comes to how people feel. People will take it and say, I actually slept through the night. I didn't get up to pee 5 times, or my anxiety is lessened. And it's because blood glucose management is at the root of everything. And you don't need a supplement or a tincture or anything even to control your glucose levels. Like you said, you can just take a walk after a meal, add the fat, the fiber, the protein. There's so many things that we can do, and it's the most tangible place to start. And it's why I love to talk about that. And also, I want to mirror this a little bit to Chinese medicine for those listening, because I love mirroring Eastern medicine to Western, but even more so Chinese medicine. And Chinese medicine talks about the spleen qi. Are you familiar with like the concept? Okay, so there's these meridians in Chinese medicine, and one of them is called the spleen. It doesn't mean the actual organ of the spleen, so it can be a little bit confusing, but it sort of refers to this metabolic pot that cooks and transforms our food, right, in the body. Each organ, essentially, or each meridian has a flavor, and the flavor of the spleen is sweet. So when you are experiencing very heavy sweet cravings, they say that your spleen qi is deficient. And the greater the sweet craving, the worse off your, quote, spleen qi is. And now I'm realizing they were talking about metabolic health. Your spleen is actually, because there's a spleen in the stomach. So I just always thought, okay, like the stomach is the digestion of the microbiome and the spleen is the digestive function, but it's actually that the stomach and the spleen is the metabolic fire. You just connected that for me. And so it's interesting. The reason I bring this up to bring it back to the spiritual is because when your spleen chi is deficient, you will emotionally, spiritually, relationally experience a lack of boundaries. You will not be able to set boundaries. You will have severe fatigue. You will have a lack of self-confidence and self-worth because it's also happening to be in your solar plexus chakra in that area. So it's relating to our self-worth and the way in which we assert ourselves in the world. And so all of this to say that simply managing our metabolic health, aka our spleen chi, through the things that you mentioned, by lessening our glucose spike so that we don't have the weakening of the spleen chi through the glucose dip, we can thus become stronger, healthier humans, even in our relationships and the way in which we move through the world.
Oh my God, that's so beautiful. I had so much fun writing about this concept of boundaries in the book. I talk about it in the book a bit about the gut lining too. You know, we talk about leaky gut, and like, it's so funny because it's like a term that still some doctors are like, oh, that's been debunked. That's pseudoscience. And I'm like, literally every major journal in America, JAMA, the Lancet's in the UK, but like Cell, Nature, they all have papers, but they just call it intestinal permeability. And I'm like, it's the same thing. It's just like the easy term. So leaky gut, intestinal permeability, basically little microscopic holes in your gut lining that allow things from the gut in that aren't supposed to be passing through that freely. And because those go into your bloodstream, are causing your body to be like, what is going on? Threat response, chronic inflammation. And fundamentally, though, it comes down to a boundary violation. And we spend a lot of time in therapy and doing the personal work so much focused on boundaries, like protecting your energy and
protecting your mitochondrial energy through boundaries.
That's right. And so when I'm eating now, and when I'm eating to love my microbiome, and then my microbiome are going to be happy, and they're actually going to help facilitate a stronger boundary in my gut with the mucus lining and with helping facilitate the tight junctions between cells. I'm thinking, okay, so just like therapy is to help me create strong boundaries in my relational life, eating fiber and polyphenols is to create strong boundaries in this tissue in my body, such that I can actually put my body, similar to relationships, in less of a state of threat because I'm not letting things in that aren't allowed. And that has been like, you know, we think about like, it's so hard to enact wellness behaviors, but something that makes it a lot easier for me is like to have frameworks that make me realize like, this is bigger than eating fiber. If you think about the gut, it's this tube from your mouth to your butt that basically is, this is crazy. We eat 70 metric tons of food in our lifetime. We eat about 2 to 3 pounds of food per day, about 1 metric ton per year. All of it passes through that tube. That is the cosmos. That is the world, everything, good, bad, toxic, not toxic, passing through us. Just like going on social media or talking to people is like relational information coming at us that we have to set boundaries to. So it is like of primary importance that we create the most intense boundaries in our gut, because 70 metric tons of potentially damaging or potentially beautiful stuff is going through.
Let's talk about bio-individual root causes, finding yours, pinpointing yours, and why one person's, quote, prescription after hearing this is not another person's. For one person to lower their inflammation, their chronic inflammation that's driving metabolic disease, they have to exercise more. They have to start lifting weights. They have to spend more time moving and walking. For another person, they're actually doing way too much in their life and they need to sleep more. They need to meditate more.
It's such an amazing point because the path towards optimal metabolic health and mitochondrial function is going to be different for each person. And that is because so many different aspects of our diet and lifestyle impact mitochondrial health. And so what needs to be true for you to get there is going to be different than what I need to do to get there? And so I think step one is understanding like what are the different aspects of our modern life that are impacting mitochondrial dysfunction. And then step two is taking really honest stock of where in your life there is areas for like moving towards a healthy relationship with that area. And so when I think about the main kind of buckets, and within each bucket, there's a lot of things to kind of think through. It's food, movement, sleep, stress, environmental toxins, light exposure, and temperature. Those are like knobs that we can turn to impact mitochondria. There's also things in food, in the food category, within actually like not the what of what we eat, but the how of how we eat. So our mindset when we sit down to meals, who we're eating with, where is our nervous system when we are eating? Because it absolutely changes our metabolic response. There's data to show this, that when you actually eat in a calm state, you have less of a glucose response than if you are stressed while you are eating. If you eat with other people, more than 3 meals a week, your metabolic health is better. If you express gratitude before your meal, it can lower people with diabetes, hemoglobin A1C. So it's the what, and then, so this is just the food category. So it's looking at these different things, understanding what matters, and then taking stock within, the stress category. Man, that's a big bucket. That comes down to how am I engaging with technology and sensationalist media? Am I allowing the stress of 8 billion people into my eyeballs, and how often on these devices? Have I resolved my deep-seated, potential childhood wounds? Have I addressed my intergenerational wounds? What is my relationship with death? Am I petrified of it or not? How do I cope with daily stressors? So looking at all these different things, what am I afraid of?
Yes, because you talk about inflammation being in this fear response in the cell.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, does that mirror fear, period?
Absolutely.
Can that mirror?
Yeah. I think that, our cells are hearing our thoughts all the time. They're transmitted through hormones. They're transmitted through neurologic signals. I think they're transmitted through how our blood vessels dilate and contract in response to emotions. And I'm sure they're transmitted through some energetic level that we totally don't understand. So like our cells hear our thoughts. And so if the thoughts are constantly scarcity, fear, pain, that is going to transmit into a threat signal in the body, and it can lead to increased inflammatory biomarkers and higher blood pressure and all those things. And so that's just talking about sort of the stress bucket and the food bucket. But what I talk about in the book is actually like surveys that people first unpacking like why each of those elements actually leads to, metabolic issues. And we kind of talked deeply about fiber, but also, and then just talked a little bit about sort of like the fear, cortisol. As cortisol goes up, it essentially inhibits mitochondria from doing their best work. And I think on the bigger level with sort of the stress bucket, it's like anything that is causing the resources of your body to go towards protection, fear response, and mitigating threat is going to be energy that's channeled away from repair and optimal thriving and getting towards the limitless, beautiful health that we want. So that I think is probably the most under-recognized bucket in all of Western medicine. It's just like the psychosocial stuff. So essentially it's step one is understanding those buckets. Step two is kind of understanding what's inside of them. And then step three is like taking a real deep look at your life and saying like, where am I crushing and where could I make some small, improvements, and then focusing on a couple of them at first, because wins beget wins. So once you start lifting weights, isn't it crazy how all of a sudden you kind of have the energy to do all these other things? So start with things where like there's really going to be like high yield, benefits. And then, so in the book, we ask people to just commit to three, like there's 25 things that you can focus on. And we just ask people to pick 3, because my belief is that if you can work towards incorporating a small number of easy changes into your life, you are going to be more motivated to keep going down that journey.
A big question I'm asking myself right now, lately, in the context of this nervous system piece that you're talking about, and in the context of our cells always being ready to fight something or respond to something or whatever it is. I've been asking myself, how often do I give myself silence? And I think it's such an important question to ask because there are so many inputs at all times. And I almost think of the cell, and now I'm imagining, thanks to you, this cell that's like giving all of its resources or being depleted by something constantly versus either being at baseline and maintaining or having the extra energy to repair and regenerate. You know, stimulation robs us of neurotransmitters in some way, right? Anytime you're hearing something, if you're listening to a YouTube video to go to bed, which I do too often, your brain is digesting that information. You're having to pay attention. Pay attention. What are you paying? You are paying in your neurotransmitters. What do your neurotransmitters cost? B vitamins, nutrients, micronutrients. It costs nutrients to make neurotransmitters, and you're paying those with your attention. So how often am I allowing myself pure silence to where I'm not having to pay anyone or anything in order to process those inputs? And if I can give myself more silence, can I then, is that what I'm missing? I think at this point that's what I'm missing. And yet I probably don't feel safe when things are silent because of trauma.
Man, I think about this all the time with I'm just so in awe of women, you know, and just like the generative capacity of women, the life-giving capacity of women. And women have much higher rates of metabolic disease than men, especially after menopause. And that has to do with estrogen depletion. Estrogen's protective for metabolism. But like women are getting metabolic diseases like diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's, dementia, twice the rates of men after age 50. And you kind of just think about like women, I think in many, these are going to be generalizations, but like are probably dealing in our modern world with maybe more sense of danger and threat, like just like walking down the street, like getting hurt. Like the expectations are so crazy on women. It's like, you know, and you think about like a 50-year-old woman, young children, maybe like teenage children, like working, be a mother, be a great wife, do all these things, be hot, you know, this and that. And it's like, when you think about it, it's like, I think I hear this from a lot of women, like the unlock for them is like, I need to do less. I need to say no. I need to be quiet, because all of that is energy going towards these just expectations and societal realities. And it's like, it's similar to, I think, what's happening with soil. Like these things in our culture that give life, that create life, you know, when you put too much on them, like you try and make them more efficient or get the most out of them, like a lot of times they end up like breaking because you're like the soil, like, you know, we're using mechanized agriculture and tilling and all these pesticides and this, that to like have higher yield from them. But what's actually happening? The soil is getting destroyed and our food system's going to potentially collapse, you know? And so it's like, when do we actually just need to trust that the cyclical nature of life-giving things, of yin and yang periods, and of, you know, ovulation and menstruation, like, and full moon and new moon, like have to be respected for the systems to work properly. And I think it's gonna be long before we understand how that actually all relates to like mitochondrial function, but there's something to it of like the silence and the rest is like absolutely necessary for this complex ecosystem of a body or a soil to work. And so
the zero output that happens when winter comes and there's nothing being grown on trees.
New moon, no moon, you know,
no light,
low tide, low tide.
Yeah.
Like it's just like menstruation.
This obsession with output that we have. It's this hustle
and
culture,
it's crushing everything.
Obsession, and it's so tied to our self-worth.
Yeah.
Where Gabrielle Lyon, one time, she's been such a mentor to me, and I would tell her on the weekends that I was just freaking the F out. And she was like, oh yeah, that's Weekend Wendy. Like Weekend Wendy comes around when you're not being productive on the weekends. And so she tells you that you have no worth because you're not producing anything and having no output just because you're resting. Yeah. And like, that's a liar. Like that girl's a liar.
Yeah.
And yet I'm still working to pull myself out of that trap, that mental trap. And I think so many women are. And it's also because of late stage capitalism. For some of us, for most of us, if you're not always working, always producing, you will fall behind. You will not be able to provide for your families.
Yeah.
In our current paradigm, not to say that we can't work together to create systems where that is not the case.
Right.
But I'm just, again, speaking to folks who are just trying to get by, working multiple jobs, and are like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
I'm always working.
I know. It's interesting. I think it's a big paradigm shift that we need to change because, and I think so much of it does have to do with our economic system, which is all about, it's about quarterly returns, right, for shareholders. It's about short-term views of efficiency. So how do you squeeze it out to make it to that quarterly benchmark? You're not thinking about the 5-year value creation. And we've adopted that into our own lives. And that doesn't work, especially for women who are like, to create life, which is, I would argue, the most powerful form of productivity in the universe, like creation of life. You have to have a cycle that has a peak and a dip. And so what monumental hubris that we have as doctors, as a culture, as a civilization, to think that we are smart. We have outsmarted nature by essentially having endless summer, by having, light on 24 hours a day, by having the fields produce wheat all year round, by having women just constantly stressed out 30 days a month. Oh my God, we're so smart. We're going to get more out of everything. We optimized it. And so, take the light bulb, we're so brilliant. We have artificial light. What has this done? We are in circadian crisis as humans. Our bodies, which literally, light is an energetic signal that tells our genes what to do. Light goes into our retina, transfers to our suprachiasmatic nucleus, entrains our clock genes to basically know whether to turn on our daytime activity or our nighttime activity. Light is that signal. And we're like, oh, well, that doesn't really matter. We'll just have light on 24 hours a day. And we know what this is doing to our bodies. It's throwing us into complete confusion. It's back to that baby metaphor. Our cells, they don't have wristwatch. They don't know. They know based on when we allow photons to hit the retina. All this is to say, we have to rest. We have to sleep. We have to slow down. We need silence because it all feeds into where our bodies are channeling energy. And a machine that's never maintained or never is able, it's just going to overheat. It's going to break, all of that. You can't drive a car for a year straight, right?
I actually think this perfectly ties into what you said before about us being terrified of death.
Mm-hmm.
We're not only terrified of death, period, actual human death. We're terrified of the many deaths that need to happen within our life. We're terrified of that period of death and darkness when something's not working anymore and we have to stop our output in that area in order to birth the next version of us that will do the next thing that will be life-giving, that is now aligned. Yeah. We're afraid of death in every single way. And I feel like I never responded earlier to the death part of this, but I loved how you said we're almost being sold this fear of death as a way to continue consuming in certain ways, because our culture does have a very strange relationship to it. And only when you are certain and face and accept the fact that you are going to die can you live intentionally.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, you're really illuminating a lot of things for me today. It's what you have to share is so beautiful because of the way that you bridge the emotional, spiritual, and the physical. Casey, what a brilliant and heart-centered mind and soul you are. Thank you so much for your presence today. And you can find all of these tips and more in Casey's book, Good Energy. Please share where we can find you otherwise.
Yes. So I am at CaseyMeans.com. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Dr. Casey's Kitchen, Dr. Casey's Kitchen. The book is available at all retailers. I will put a plug in. Buying at a local bookstore or at bookshop.org is actually the best way that this book can get into as many hands as possible.
Let's not be codependent on Amazon.
That's right. Yeah. So if you're up for ordering from bookshop.org, that's wonderful, but also available on Amazon and every other retailer. So those are the best ways to find me. And then my company is Levels Health. And Levels is where people can get access to continuous glucose monitors to understand a little bit more about their blood sugar spikes and crashes and things like that. So that's levelshealth.com.
Yeah, I know I didn't mention it, but she's a big deal. Levels is a big deal. So we love it. Thanks for putting continuous glucose monitors in our hands, in our arms.
Yeah, arms. Yeah.
Thanks again, Casey.